Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and it is a 2-for-1 show again on the channel as Christoper, Jary, and James Porter join us to continue the story of 231 Brigade from Malta to Sicily. If you are new to the channel, we've had a few new people over the last few days. Welcome aboard. Please consider supporting us on Patreon or becoming a YouTube channel member. And of course, the links to everything you need is in the description below, including Christoper and James's book. You'll find there where you can buy it at the Keep Museum. And you can find out about merchandise and social media links, etc., etc. Without further ado, I'll bring James and Christoper in. Good evening, guys. How are you today?
Very well.
Good evening.
So I have to ask you, Christoper, you did a solo performance, your debut on World War II TV. Now you've brought a co-pilot, a wingman, and an adjutant, wherever you want to. How did you two get together, and what was the process of you working on the book?
Well, I was a volunteer at the Keep for some years. And about 10 years ago, James came to see me because he was thinking of starting a military history group in Wessex. And he wondered if he could base it at the Keep. And we did just that. And it's been a huge success, thanks to James. He gives a lot of the talks, but he gets a lot of interesting speakers as well. And it's an absolutely fabulous thing. Meantime, he also researched his father, who was at Devon. And I've asked him specifically today to wear his Devon tie. So there it is. Yeah. So that James is not a Devon. James was a Royal Regiment of Fusiliers officer. But he's wearing his dad's regimental tie today as a tribute to the people we're talking about. He's a volunteer at the Keep. He joined the group, the research group, who helped me write the books. And he's worked on 4 different books with me. This one, though, owes him more than anyone else. He played an enormous part in the Sicily book, and that's why I've asked him to join us this evening. And you'll see why. Nobody will be in any doubt when you hear his description of Regalbuto, the Battle of Regalbuto, which his father fought in.
Brilliant. Well, James, that you've been given a fantastic introduction there. So, father in the Devons, was it something that you grew up understanding the importance of what this brigade did? Was it an interest that came later? Was it always there? Did your father talk about it, etc., etc., etc.?
The interest came later. I mean, I've come from a military family. My father was in the army, and my uncles were Army and Air Force, and my brother-in-law, my cousin, all in the Army or Air Force. And but the interest in particular in 231 Brigade only came really because although I talked to my father about it before he died, I didn't get a really good feel for the exact detail until when I moved to this area and went to see the Keep Museum, and I realized that all the records for the Devons was kept there at the museum, as well as the records for the Dorsets. And I met Christoper and got into doing the research. And that's when I had access to the war diaries, which I'd seen at Kew, but it's quite difficult to get to Kew and get access to them. But down at the museum, I could get them all the time, and it all came to light. And after that, I went and visited Sicily and retraced the steps of the brigade, and so it's fascinating for me. I spent 41 years in the army, and I just wish that I could have gone back there with my father whilst he was still alive.
Well, yeah, that's the eternal thing, isn't it? The people finding out about their father, their uncle, their grandfather, or even their grandmother after they've passed away, or only getting the interest later on. But that's another question. But you've come armed with a PowerPoint, which we'll bring up on screen, and it's basically over to James and Christoper. Take us through this, folks. Fire away with your questions. We won't ask too many because I feel the presentation will be pretty slick and pretty informative. But you know the score. You can fire away, and we'll address them to the two guys. So over to you, gentlemen.
Right. Well, I'd first of all like to ask you to imagine you're General Montgomery. It's early 1943. You've chased Rommel across Libya from Alamein, and you're now about to enter Tunisia. But the war's carrying on elsewhere, and plans are being made for the invasion of Sicily. And you're asked to command part of that invasion. What would you like, if you were Monty, what would you like as a surprise gift?
Are you asking me? You asking?
Well, why not? Let's ask you.
Well, I'd probably want a break first.
You're Monty, you're not Paul.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know. I'll let you tell me where we're going with this.
I will tell you. How about if you found an entire pre-war trained regular army brigade intact in 1953? Eh? Now that's not bad, is it? And of course there was one on Malta, and we looked at those last time we met. And here they were. They were known as the First Malta Brigade at this point. They've spent the last few years during the siege of Malta defending and repairing airfields, mending roads, providing anti-aircraft defense, servicing, protecting aircraft, building protective pens for them, unloading stores from cargo ships that have come into port. There we are. They're doing that. And rescuing people and possessions from bombed buildings. And that's the scale of the bombing. And that's Valletta. Defending the island against invasion and preparing for operations elsewhere. That's the First Hampshires, and those are their 3-inch mortars, and they're actually training, I think, on Gozo. But they were training there for the invasion of Sicily, believe it or not, before anybody thought that we were going to invade Sicily. So the long siege had cost them 75 lives, and it had left the survivors 2 stone lighter on average than they had been, but they were in pretty good shape otherwise. All they needed was feeding up and training to play a leading part in the Allies' first step back into Europe. So this was absolutely a Christmas present for Monty, a couple of months late. And he made the most of them and grabbed them. Now, James is going to introduce the background to the campaign very briefly, because I know we've done a lot of it already.
Yeah, and as Christopher said, we're not going to go into the background in any great detail because it's quite well known. But I think suffice to say that, well, we're going to concentrate on the men of 231 Brigade and their battles. Just to sum up some of the background, I would say that when the Allies landed on the beaches of Sicily in the morning of 10th of July 1943, that day, 10th of July, became and remains the greatest amphibious invasion in history in terms of the first 24 hours. Operation Overlord in Normandy was greater in scale over many days, but not in the first 24 hours. Now, the initial plan, which you can see there, was for the British to land in the southeastern corner of Sicily, whilst the Americans landed in the northwest. Now, the plan was subject to a lot of modification, and as a result of General Sir Bernard Montgomery, Monty's assertion that the plan failed to follow the military principle of concentration of effort, the US landings were now planned to take place adjacent to and to the west of the British, as you can see in this slide. Then, after some considerable preparatory bombing of airfields, as you can see there, and other defenses, which almost eliminated the Luftwaffe's ability to fight. And also after some parachute and glider-borne landings, a vast allied of, in fact, an armada of allied ships consisting of convoys, which had sailed from the United States in some cases, from the UK in others, and from ports in North Africa, and escorted by no fewer than 2,500 warships, arrived off the beaches of southeast Sicily on the 10th of July. Now, what was facing them? Well, facing them was an Axis force of varying quality. There were 2 first-rate German divisions, plus supporting troops numbering over 60,000 Germans. As well, there were 48,000 regular Italian troops in 4 theoretically deployable divisions, and a further 175,000, mainly older men and boys, in static coastal divisions. The American landings to the west of the British suffered aerial attack, as you can see there, and especially at Gela, And at Gela, there was also a determined German attack by tanks. And you can see from that slide how very close the tanks got to the beach itself. But for a description of 231 Brigade's experience, I'll now hand back to Christoper.
Now, what I'd like to do is just introduce some of the key officers in March 1943, when 1st Malta Brigade became 231 Malta Brigade. They would Monty would pick them up from Malta and take them to Egypt. And very soon after getting to Egypt, they lost their brigadier, who was a greatly loved and very able chap called Kenneth Pierce Smith, who'd done a great deal to train them and to form them into the very professional outfit they were. He was the one who'd actually run Exercise Sicilia, which foresaw and rehearsed the landings, apparently on the very spot that they were now going to be asked to land on. So he was a percipient chap. Now let's have a look at some of these commanding officers. He said confidently.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not.
Is it the next set, is it? Yeah.
No, it's gone to the other slideshow.
Okay, no.
Oh, it's got back. Yeah, okay.
That's the last image in that set of slides.
Needs to go to. Can't be.
Yeah, there's 20 slides, and that's number 20. Technical hitch, folks. We'll be back with you as soon as we can. That's the last slide in that set, James.
Well, it's yeah, it wasn't when we ran it through, so I'm not sure what's happened there.
It's not the next set yet, is it?
Shouldn't be.
Okay. Do you want to talk about something, Chris? You can see if you can find another set and upload it again, James.
I'm very happy to introduce these people without pictures. You know, they're not Hollywood film stars. Their looks are secondary. Okay, so let's talk about who these people were. First of all, we had Bill Valentine, who took over as he was commanding officer of the 2nd Devons. All of these commanding officers, all 3 commanding officers in the brigade, had served in the First World War. He'd served in Africa. He was an expert tactician, and this is going to become very relevant later on when we look at his how he conducted the battle at Regalbuto, which was a triumph of tactics. Commanding the 1st Hampshires was Bill Spencer. Now, he had got into the First World War just a little bit earlier than the others, and he'd won 2 military crosses very quickly, served on the Northwest frontier. So he's a very good regimental officer and a fighting soldier. The 3rd one, commanding the 1st Dorsets, was a chap called Brooke Ray, one of 3 brothers who were all commanding officers in the army. The other 2 were killed. Brooke Ray was wounded. He'd already been wounded in 1918. He'd served as a regimental officer in Malabar and in Palestine. And the new chap that Monty brought in to be the brigadier, to take over 231 Malta Brigade, was Roy Urquhart, who, of course, we all know from a very different setting. And actually, what you could have as a subtitle for this talk is, which is called Roy's Boys, you could have how Roy Urquhart came to command 1st Airborne Division, because it was his handling of this campaign, which where he proved himself a real thruster, as we'll see, that actually won him the reputation that Monty spotted him and made him appointed him later to command 1st Airborne for Arnhem. Now, on the 30th of March 1943, they left Malta and they embarked for Egypt. And here they went in 3 different directions. The men mainly went off for a rest and to be fed up, literally. And they ate and ate. And some of them were very ill to begin with because they got out of the habit of eating. They trained and they were learning all about landing craft, which they'd never come across before. Practicing getting a whole platoon of infantry out of a landing craft at speed. All the commanding officers, meanwhile, some officers and a few non-commissioned officers joined the 8th Army in Tunisia and joined in some of their battles going on there. Bill Spencer, being rather keen, this is the guy who commanded the 1st Hampshires, went off with the Gurkhas to take Jebel Ghazi and was badly wounded in the leg and put himself out of action until they finally went to Sicily. He got back in time to go with them, but all the training was done by his second in command. The staff, meanwhile, got on with the planning, and there are 2 people I'd like to mention here particularly. One is Major Dennis Stenhouse, who was a sapper officer, who was the brigade landing officer and did a fantastic job. And the second one was the Brigade Major Will Tuffill, an officer of the Queen's Own Royal West Kents. Both had to learn on the job how to plan and conduct an assault landing. Very important to realize here that this was completely new territory for all of them. So they were finding their way. And those 2 are 2 of the unsung heroes of this because they set it up so that the landing succeeded.
We've got a couple of questions just coming in before we kind of completely leave Malta. Peter O'Connell is saying, were 231 Brigade assigned to Husky because Malta was considered secure at that point, or were they replaced by other units there? Because obviously Malta is still, it's not lost any less of its vital role in the middle of the Mediterranean there. But yes, the battle has, or the war has moved on a bit. So were they replaced in Malta?
No, as far as I know, they weren't. But by this time, one has to remember there were other brigades on Malta. There were 2 other brigades there already. So you were just reducing the strength on Malta by about a third from the point of view of the infantry. Right. And really, the threat had passed by this time.
Okay.
Paul, if I could just interject there.
Yep.
If you could delete the first slide pack, it won't let me load it again because I've got 2 slideshows on. So if you could delete the first one with the Maltese cross
I've got nothing showing now. It's when you left, both sets have gone now. I can't see anything now.
Okay. In that case, it may let me do it. Hang on.
Okay. Well, while you're doing that, I'll just ask another question. Because you mentioned there, Christopher, about some of the officers going to Tunisia, and you talked at length last time about the job they've been doing on Malta, and very important, very, very pivotal to the defense of Malta. But it wasn't really an aggressive infantry training. Was there a conscious decision by the higher ups to say that we need to get some of these officers some fresh experience of actually facing the enemy, and therefore sending people to Tunisia, or bringing indeed people from Tunisia to join the brigade?
Not the latter.
Right.
They were reinforced by some people from the 8th Army, but not not within the units particularly, not very many. But certainly it was a case of sending the existing officers, particularly the commanding officers, off to Tunisia to learn how to fight a battle. You've got to remember, this is the time that Monty decided he was going to have a conference for senior commanders in the American Army and the 8th Army, how to win battles. So there was a lot of learning going on. And the 8th Army were pretty tired by now. They'd fought all the way from Alamein. So the injection of some new blood for them was really helpful before Sicily. But those people had to learn how to fight, and none of them had actually fought a battle before. Almost none.
Just while James is sorting himself out, one of the kind of imponderable questions we've had on this channel is, if you're a UK-based unit, you're receiving the updated training manuals sooner than other people. You're getting the information, the bump that's coming out of, the War Office is coming to you first. So new ideas, new weapons, new tactics. But if you're in the field, if you're in India, if you're in Malta, you're perhaps more skilled at engaging the enemy, but you're perhaps using the manuals from 2 and 3 years previously. So it's that which is better, to be getting the latest information, UK-based, that's coming from experience from the battlefield, or is it better to be in the battlefield yourself and kind of see firsthand? Have you got any kind of response to that?
I mean, I have no experience to draw on, but I do have a father who was trained in England before Normandy, and didn't think much of the battle schools. He felt that actually most of the battle schools were run by theoreticians. They didn't tend to bring people back, experienced officers, to teach, to train people at the battle schools. And as a consequence, they were taught a theory which they had to unlearn when they got to Normandy. For example, they were taught that they could take 20 men out on a patrol at night. Quite impossible. Nobody can control 20 people in the dark, all going in different directions. 5 or 6 is the number that you needed. All of that sort of stuff they learned as they went on. So actually there was no real substitute for experience until divisions like the 43rd Wessex Division started putting experienced officers in charge of their own divisional battle school, which Butch Thomas created. And that worked very well. So it's about the reality.
Yes, it's bringing both elements together, isn't it? Bringing the battlefield experience together with the latest thinking and somehow pulling out of that the recipe for success. But yes.
Most of the latest thinking came from the battle experience people.
Right. So, James, where are we?
It wouldn't do it.
We've still only got the 20 slides there.
Shall I carry on?
Let's carry on. I love this. We're improvising. We're in the battlefield. We're improvising against an unknown enemy of tech problems, but we're overcoming them with sheer British pluck and fortitude, Christopher.
Well, that's very nice of you to say so. Right. The final exercise after training in Egypt, which they did a lot of, including running around the pyramids at one point, their final final exercise actually took place at somewhere that's familiar to us for other reasons, because they went and they invaded Aqaba. They landed on the beach there. When we get the photographs going, there are 8 wonderful photographs there of the Hampshires actually landing, which is really interesting to see. They also had excellent intelligence. They had a very good updated picture of the units they would be facing that James detailed a little bit earlier on. And they realized that they were going to be facing mostly Italian troops, and they would be of very variable quality. But at some point, they were going to have to meet the Germans in battle. And they are a very different proposition. So they knew that already. They also had APIS pictures, so photographic interpretation pictures taken from Malta-based Spitfires. And I was really interested in this, and I found out something today about this, which I'll share with you. What I say in the book is that here are 2 photographs taken by a photographic reconnaissance Spitfire of 683 Squadron, which was commanded by Adrian Warburton, who we all know. Yep, the doyen of PR pilots.
Yep.
What I didn't realize was these photographs were actually taken by him personally.
Oh.
And he was smoking a cigar at the time, I'm told. He took them from 200 feet, roaring over the landing places that was planned. And he took vertical ones, and he took some obliques as he was flying away. So these were then marked up by the aerial photography interpretation section, APIS, to show the known defences on the beach.
Right.
And the beach they were going to land at was on the southeast tip of of Sicily, and it was called Marzamimi. Tiny little fishing port, really small.
Okay, while James is sorting himself out, still more questions. Trevor is asking, did they use terrain models in planning?
I have never seen them mentioned.
Okay.
What they did
answer that one.
What they did have was some extremely good maps, because the men were only told that they were going to invade the officers knew, but the men were only told about Sicily once they were aboard the troop ship heading for Sicily. And at that point, maps were placed all the way around the decks so that they could stand beside them and really learn. And these were, sensible, intelligent maps that went right down, backed up by APIS photography, right down to the ground, and told you the most detailed information.
Brilliant. And then one last question, temporarily from Trevor again, who's our Tunisia expert. Did 231 Brigade have training with tanks, aircraft and heavy artillery before going into Husky? Again, referencing what they've been doing on Malta. They've been doing everything but working with tanks and heavy artillery and aircraft. Well, they're repairing airfields, but that's not quite the same thing.
Once again, I've come across nothing that mentions those. Right. They did have certainly their their supporting anti-tank unit and their field gunners. They worked very, very closely with indeed. But as far as heavy artillery and RAF cooperation, I'm far from sure. Although they were able to bring into support Royal Navy ships and some of their gunfire.
So James has not only got problems with his slides, he's also sneezing all over the place. We're man down. Oh, blimey.
Where 231 Brigade were unbelievably unlucky, and they were unlucky on all 3 assault landings that they made, first on Sicily, then on Italy, and finally on D-Day. Where they were really unlucky was with the weather. Every time they got aboard a ship, a bloody storm blew up. And that's exactly what happened as they set off across the Mediterranean. In the last 24 hours, conditions aboard the ships became absolutely appalling. People were throwing up all over the place, and they were in a terrible state. One man, actually, not in our brigade, but in one of the Scottish, I think in 51st Highland Division, actually died of seasickness.
Wow.
Died. It was that bad. So, of course, they were desperate to get ashore. And in the very early hours of the 10th of July, they boarded their landing craft. First time they'd been, only the second time, in fact, they'd been on those. They'd been used at Aqaba. And they were lowered into this appalling sea. Everyone was seasick as soon as they got into those. 2 of the people, one of them, my friend Dennis Bounsell, who was a stretcher bearer in A Company, he was given the first tot of rum he'd ever had in his life, and he drank this rum and was very, very seriously seasick. As a consequence, he lived to 101. He only died a couple of years ago, and he never drank rum again. Wow. So conditions were absolutely awful. One Devon officer, Martin Hastings, who was commanding A Company of the Devons, had one of his landing craft swamped. And as a consequence, he had to land and fight the first day with only 2 of his 3 platoons. A serious loss. The same thing happened to somebody on D-Day too, one of the company commanders. The Royal Navy had got them to the right place. And the first person to land was Captain Charles Martin, and he was commanding C Company of the 1st Dorsets. And he was 27 years old. He'd been commissioned in 1936 into the Dorset Regiment, and he was a professional soldier. He'd spent the entire siege of Malta on Malta. And at 03:45 hours, he made a scramble landing on a rocky beach at Marzamimi. And he was first ashore. And then they had to break their way into the village and clear the top of the beach. It was his job to do that, to enable the following units with the other assault battalion, the Hampshires, to land. And they climbed a seawall, got into the village, and as they climbed over the seawall, they took their first fatal casualty. Private Arthur Smith, 31 years old. He just married a Maltese woman called Dolores during the siege. he was killed, and he was the first casualty in the brigade. Several other men were wounded, including a platoon commander. So the Italians at this point were putting up some sort of a defense, not a particularly fierce one, and certainly not a very professional one, but some of them were having a good shot at these invaders. Charles Martin lost one of his platoon commanders, a subaltern from the DCLI attached to the Dorsets, but he pressed on into the tiny town square. And here he personally, Charles Martin, led an attack on a pillbox and cleared it before moving down onto the sandy beach to make sure that it was clear, not mined, and that there wasn't too much wire there. And actually he found it completely clear. And that enabled then the rest of the Dorsets and the Hampshires to come in. And the Dorset's landing officer, a chap called Richard Harris, arrived and set off up the beach to mark out his battalion's axis of advance. Meanwhile, on their left, so the Dorsets were on the right, the Hampshires were on the left, and the Devons were in reserve. Meanwhile, on their left, Tony Boyd's company of Hampshires had landed at the other end of the beach and found some barbed wire. There was some there. And here they did something quite extraordinary. Tony Boyd, who was a captain, and his friend Corporal Ginger Higgins, who's gone down in history for having a mildly obscene tattoo on his arm, threw themselves onto the wire in order to enable their comrades to climb over them and to get to the top of the beach. And that's what they did.
Wow.
Extraordinarily brave thing. Tony Boyd got a military cross. Ginger Higgins got a military medal. Company then, sorry.
Oh, so I said, wow, that's all.
No, it's a fantastic story. A very brave man. Tony Boyd came back and did it again on D-Day later. A Company had a firefight with two pillboxes on the beach, and they captured them both. So there were these token sort of pockets of defense going on, which they had to deal with, and one mustn't underestimate those. But a lot of it was really what you might call opera buffet. I mean, Willie Hayes, who I mentioned last time, do you remember? He was an officer of the Dorsets who was rather a humorist. And he told a story afterwards about an Italian officer who was on leave, and he was captured in his pajamas. And he came to see Captain Willie Hayes. He was absolutely furious because he said, I can't be taken prisoner. I'm on leave. And Hayes thought this was hysterically funny. Meanwhile, there was an Italian woman giving birth somewhere, and some of the medics moved off to look after her. So all sorts of, all the chaos of battle happening here, the funny things, the tragic things, all happening around you. But it really was token defense. And the succeeding waves cut through these Italians like butter. Except there was one really brave thing that some Italian armor did. 12 tiny, badly armored, light French tanks,
right,
a third the size of the Shermans that the brigade had put ashore, put in an attack on 46th Royal Tank Regiment Shermans. And of course, they were just bang. It was like the Tigers with the Shermans in Normandy later on. Bang, bang, bang. And three of them are ablaze. In fact, they're disintegrated. And the people inside are all dead. And that was the one really serious counterattack that they tried. I mean, it wasn't serious even. It was pathetic, but incredibly brave thing to do. And these things were just a dozen of these tanks were just around the battlefield, blazing and with black smoke coming up from them, and their crews being incinerated inside. Very, very sad.
Now, we should check in with James, see where James is. What's the state of play?
What's happening is it's not letting me upload. It says there's a problem with it, and my suggestion is that if Christopher continues, there's not that far to go before part 2 opens, and obviously hope that part 2 is all intact.
Okay.
Okay.
Christopher's painting us a wonderful image with words. We're doing perfectly.
Well, that's very nice of you to say so. I will do my best. But
Okay.
the best words come from the people themselves.
Super.
And here is Martin Hastings, who was the company commander in the Devons A Company, who lost one of his landing craft and one of his platoons because it was swamped. So he's now landed, and he now leads the advance. The Devons come in between the Devons, the Dorsets on the right and the Hampshires on the left, and they advance up through the middle. And what Hastings wrote about this, how he described it later, eventually, he says, we came to where an Italian battery was supposed to be. I couldn't see any Italians at all, but I could see one or two of the guns. We went charging into these guns and there wasn't a soul. So I thought, well, that's extraordinary. And then I heard some noise coming from a dugout. So I had a flash grenade, which made a lot of noise and didn't do much harm. And I chucked one of these down it, and all hell was let loose. After a lot of shouting, out came about 50 Italians with their hands up. So I thought, good, what do I do with this lot? So we sat them down, and I went on a little bit until I saw a hat sticking up on the end of a stick on the other side of a long wall. I fired my Tommy gun along the top of that, and up jumped another 50 Italians, all wanting to surrender. So I had to get rid of them, and I sent them off with a section down to the beach. And I didn't see that section for 24 hours. So by this time, I was getting a bit thin of men. B Company of the Dorsets, so this is the battalion over on the right-hand side, racing forward unexpectedly fast. They'd been given permission to take the same position that Hastings claims to have taken. But they too found it empty. When they got there, there were no guns and no people there. So both the howitzers of 165 Field Regiment and the guns on a Dutch sloop, which was back offshore supporting the brigade's landing, both them claimed to have knocked out the battery. So the question remains about this action that Hastings describes, and Sergeant Beadle of the Dorsets also describes, and they both claim to have captured the battery. The question remains, who knocked it out? Was it the Dutch sailors, or was it 165 Field Regiment's gunners? And who captured it? Was it the Dorsets or the Devons? All you can say for certain is that it was captured by advancing troops of 231 Brigade, and that it was already badly hit by gunfire.
Reminds me of a funny story. I'll just interrupt you now. I was on Gold Beach 20 years ago, 25, whichever anniversary it was, with a group of Sherwood Rangers veterans and a group of Essex Yeomanry veterans. They were looking at the casemate there at Arnhem. And as we know, similar situation, everybody was firing at it. Exactly which unit put the winning shot in, who's to say? And the veterans were much younger than it was 25 years ago. They were kind of arguing quite boisterously about which unit did it, and they kind of knew I was a bit of a history buff. I wouldn't say historian then. They asked me to settle it, and I'm like, oh God, I'm keeping out of this one, I said, and they said, no, you've got to say something, because if you don't say anything, you're pissing us all off. They said. I said, well, I don't know. And then something happened elsewhere, and they were distracted by, hopefully it was alcohol or something. And I never had to say in front of the veterans whether or not I thought it was the Rangers or the Essex Yeomanry. I mean, as I'm from Essex, I think they thought I had an Essex-leaning bias. But what's interesting about these things, Christopher, as you know, and James knows, is sometimes there's never a resolution to these stories. That you've got multiple things happening at the same time. Everybody's laying down a fire at a particular position. Does it really matter? It's the Michael Wittmann in Normandy. Does it really matter who got him?
It's whether it happened.
Yeah, whether it happened.
And ultimately who won. But funnily enough, James Holland and I worked together on this very question. And we think we've cracked it.
Right.
And if we do Normandy at some stage, I'll tell you what I think happened, what James and I both think happened there. Because I think it's a two-stage process. Nobody's lying, but one thing happened late morning and another thing happened in the middle of the afternoon. And both of them were very important, and neither knew about the other one.
Spoiler alert. Can't wait to bring you back for that one. So yeah, we've gone off a massive rabbit hole, but it's one of those imponderables about how you determine these things when everything's happening at the same time, and battle honors and claims, and it's the same thing with in the air with the RAF against the Luftwaffe, isn't it? You know, they say they lost 20, we claim we got 40. Where's the truth in between these figures? It's what makes ultimately what keeps us persevering to try and find out the truth is that there are still questions to be resolved.
When you're in the middle of something, it doesn't feel like history.
No.
And many of those Battle of Britain pilots won't have realized, actually, that they were fighting such an important battle or what it was all about. And they certainly didn't see it as the Battle of Britain. That was a later thing.
And the people will be talking about it 80 plus years later.
It's just a blur.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
And most of them were knackered at the time. The photographs of some of those pilots I've seen, young men, 21, 22, who look middle-aged. Mm. They're just knackered.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Now, so where are we? Mazamimi has fallen very quickly with very, very little problem. Very few casualties amongst only 3 casualties, fatal casualties, to the whole brigade. It's an extraordinary thing. And the Sicilians, some of them are treating this as a sort of liberation. If you see how some of the Germans behaved when they were there, you can understand precisely why. The big point, though, now was that 231 Brigade, the road lay open ahead of them. They were heading inland unopposed. And they were heading for a place called Noto, which is a very beautiful place. And James went and took some pictures there for me when we were producing the book. Alan Wicker, who was there, not with the Devons, although he was a Devon officer, described fighting these battles around there like fighting in a museum. There's no doubt, though, about who were the stars of this advance. It was James's father's 2nd Devons. They were absolutely fabulous. They went in their first 30 hours on Sicily. Bill Valentine's 2nd Devons advanced 14 miles across the river to Laro and captured Noto in 30 hours. And the brigade's wonderful intelligence officer, Reg Gilchrist, who was a solicitor from Preston, Blackpool, a solicitor from Blackpool. I met his daughter. She was lovely. He wrote and said, the rapid advance to Noto and the securing of the river Tilaro were more than a personal triumph for the 2nd Devons. It was a move of the greatest strategic importance. By bringing troops into the Noto area, it provided 13 Corps with a firm base from which to strike northwards against Catania and the airfield at Gerbini. It relieved the whole of 30 Corps from a state of congestion in this peninsula, which was getting clogged. I mean, it really was. So many troops coming in. Even after this outlet had been provided, the Canadians were squeezed out of the early part of the campaign by the Highland Division on the right and the Americans on the left. Had 231 Brigade and the Highland Division not secured this outlet to the north and been able to start the long movement which went by Palazzolo, Vizzini and Caltagirone, the whole campaign might have been prolonged by several weeks. So this success and the Devons advance was a triumph.
Thank you. And so for those who are less familiar with this operation, did they have one objective? Was it a series of phase 1, phase 2, phase line on the invasion day? Explain what the brigade was.
It wasn't as formal. It wasn't as formal as that.
Get as far as you can.
Get as far as you can. And of course, with somebody like Roy Urquhart, you just went. If there was an opportunity, you went. And that's precisely what they did. So on the 3rd day, they've been.
Paul, can we go into the second slideshow now?
That'd
be nice.
You just have to double click it again so I can bring it up.
Keep your fingers crossed, everyone. Let's hope.
Yeah. So slides, and then double click it again, and it should come up. Everybody's willing it to succeed. The nation is waiting.
More than most.
I've always got any questions while we're waiting. I think we're right. There we go. Super.
Here we have a map. ladies and gentlemen, we're in business. Right. You can see they landed at Marzamimi down there in the bottom right-hand corner.
Yep.
They then went to Noto, which we've just been talking about.
Yep.
If you follow the route on, they're going up at 45 degrees there through Vizzini, Caltagirone, up to Ragusa, across the River d'Etano and up to Agira. At Agira, they will turn right and they'll go to Regalbuto there. That's what we're going to be talking about in the whole of this. This is their route. And they're now making this colossal progress from Noto going up north there. So if I will continue, and I hope we have some pictures, because I'm now going to say confidently, here is a typical landscape inland from the coast where the enemy would be holding positions in and around hill towns, perched precariously on precipitous rocky heights. So the whole battle is about capturing places like that. That's Agira, which the Dorsets fought around and lost a lot of men trying to get, and the Canadians finally took from the west. But you can see what that's like. I mean, it's imagine that. So let's think what the character was like. First of all, they were entering this mountainous territory where the enemy would be holding positions on these sorts of precipitous rocks. Second, their enemy had changed because the Germans were now in business. They were now facing them. And having been surprised by the invasion in the southeast, the Germans were now getting their act together and producing a formidable defense. The rocks provided well-defended hiding places for artillery, for mortars, and for Spandau light machine guns. For the men of 231 Brigade, this was their first introduction to the rip of a MG42 Spandau as it fired 1,200 rounds a minute, and of the deafening noise and deadly splintering of mortar bombs bursting on jagged, rocky terrain. Think of the wounds that those bits of rock, bits of splinters, all tearing you to bits. A third unpleasant aspect to the campaign, which you've really got to remember, is that we're in Sicily in July.
Yeah.
Second half of July, right? What's Sicily like? Sweltering. Wearing a tin hat like those guys are. Heavily laden infantry. They must have sweated blood. Those dusty roads, see what they're walking on? It's not a made-up road. It's not tarmacked. It's a dusty road, sent up clouds of white choking dust, which blinded you as you drove along or as you walked. Really uncomfortable in the scent you got in your mouth, choked you. And at worst of all, of course, as soon as a vehicle went past, up goes a column of dust, and every 88 for miles around spots where you are, and wham. So it's that is the nature of the campaign we're describing from beginning to end. It only lasted 3 weeks, but actually each one was a nasty little battle. And what we're going to do is describe 2 battles tonight. I'm going to do Vizzini, which is the next one here, just along the road. So this is their first battle against the Germans. And then James is going to do the set piece at Regalbuto. Vizzini, frankly, was a bit of a balls up. And you'll see why. These are inexperienced troops. They've not done an attack before. They've just done a landing. And this is what happened. Okay, so 13th of July found the Devons leading what essentially was a mobile column known as Harpoon Force, leading the advance northwest towards central Sicily. They were using all available vehicles, including, as you see here, anti-tank gun Portees. They take the gun off, and they found, believe it or not, they could get a platoon on one of those. God knows what it did to the suspension, but, you know, who cares? Their next objective was the town of Vizzini. And the brigadier, that's down on the left-hand side there, and the brigadier commanding this column was not actually, at this stage, Urquhart, because it was an armoured column. And so the brigadier was George Richards of the 23rd Armoured Brigade. His first plan for taking Vizzini was a night attack by the 1st Hampshires, and his first thoughts were right. But at that moment, they saw some German traffic coming out of Vizzini and thought they're leaving it. We'll try and bounce them out. So he decided to attack at once. And coming up the road on that with the red arrow there, you had a squadron of 50th Royal Tank Regiment leading the way up the road and round a bend towards Vizzini. C Company of the 2nd Devons, commanded by Bubbles Duke, Hugh Duke, son of a clergyman from Devon, turned out to be a very, very brave young officer indeed, 25 years old.
About 12 there.
I know. That's why it was called Bubbles, I think. You know, the painting. So 2nd Devons, the C Company of the 2nd Devons under Duke advanced with 50 RTR astride the road. As they rounded the bend, the leading 2 Dingo scout cars and a Sherman tank were knocked out. The crew of the tank were incinerated. Troopers Brown, Crowther and Gill have no known grave, and they're commemorated on a memorial. And one of the things that I found when I was writing this book and we were researching it was that all came from South Yorkshire, and they had consecutive army numbers. They'd enlisted together. They'd enlisted together, one after the other, and now they died together in the furnace of a blazing Sherman. Beside Bubbles Duke, who's standing on the exposed road with Spandau bursts all around him, mortar bursts and 88s firing. Beside him was his wireless operator, Private Vernon Britton. And on his 18 set, he could hear the squadron leader of the Royal Tank Regiment squadron shouting that I need some foot sloggers. Duke led his company forward to do what he could, past the remaining Shermans, which were desperately trying to reverse back round the bend to get out of the 88's range. And the 23rd Armoured Brigade history records that their tanks were trapped on the road with anti-tank fire in front, shells falling behind, mortars firing very accurately on the road, with sniping from the high bank dominating the road for good measure. Duke's company's task was to locate and destroy the enemy's anti-tank guns. But the Germans now opened up with artillery, mortar, Spandau and rifle fire. On the right of the road, they ran forward through some German positions and found a deserted German artillery position with 4 abandoned guns. But beyond were 2 more hills, which you can see here in the contours there to the right of the road, north of it there. You can see those 2 hills. And of course, they're overlooking the road, and there were Germans up there firing down on them. To go on, Hugh Duke realized was impossible, so he decided to withdraw. He'd already taken 10 fatal casualties just in his company, and he'd had several more wounded. Lieutenant James Campbell, one of his platoon commanders, found himself with one of his rifle sections cut off behind the German positions, which they'd run through. So they'd gone through the German positions. Now they were going to have to run back through them. He led them back in a charge through the bewildered Germans, who must have wondered what the hell was going on, knocking out 2 machine guns as they went, and then through heavy mortar fire. And he made it back. Duke and Campbell won the Devon's first 2 military crosses of the war. And Vernon Britton, with his wireless set, who'd stuck by Hugh Duke right the way through all this, just to make sure he was in touch with what's going on, got a military medal. My God, they earned them. Richards realised now, the Brigadier realised that that original plan was not a good idea, and we'd better go back to what the night attack that he first of all envisaged. And he arranged for the 1st Hampshires to launch a night attack on the hill called the Green Knoll. This was much more sensible, but it was still not, it was a company attack, and it probably should have been a battalion. The preliminary artillery barrage seemed to fall to the right of the crest, and Sergeant Harry Bowers said to his platoon commander that he thought this was they needed to be aware of that. Two other platoon commanders, as they tried to scale up towards the top of the green knoll there, John Lebrecht, a Channel Islander, and Ralph Coombe were killed attacking the hill, along with 3 of their men and many others wounded. This photograph gives you a good illustration of the terrain. This was taken by our regimental secretary, Jeff Nichols, and his wife when they were on holiday there recently. And it shows the ravine that the Devons had to cross down and up. And the German positions were up around those where those wind pumps are. Okay. The whole area was heavily overgrown. Sergeant Bowers said it was an evil piece of country. Shrubs, small trees, huge boulders. Men would step on a boulder and then disappear in a huge pit or crevice. Before long, I found it impossible to keep the platoon together. Remember, it's dark. Bowers and Corporal Byng then crawled down the reverse slope where they found the German positions, had a firefight with the Germans. That's over that slope here with the wind pumps. And then crawled back. At 0200, a fierce German counterattack threw the remaining Hampshires off the top of the hill. By dawn, they were back to square one. While another brigade attacked the next hill, the 1st Dorsets were ordered to attack this one again. So this was the 3rd attack by the brigade on pretty much the same feature. With a troop of the 300th Anti-Tank Battery in support, Pat Chilton's B Company led the attack in daylight up that hill. Lieutenant Nigel Stickland, a Leicestershire Regiment officer attached to the Dorsets, reached the top of the hill at midday and found it amazingly easy. And he signalled down to his colleagues at the foot of the hill that he'd got it. But Nigel Stickland was a new officer. He didn't know that what the Germans did very often was to give up a position relatively easily and then launch a really fierce counterattack almost immediately. And that's exactly what happened. And sadly, one of the first to be killed was recently married Nigel Stickland. His platoon sergeant, Arthur Skingley, who I think we have a picture of here. Yep, there he is. It's not a particularly good picture, but it's the only one we got. Arthur Skingley was a Cockney, and he took command of Stickland's platoon and fought back against this counterattack with a great deal of vigour. And what he said about it was, I took command of the platoon and carried on with the attack. Zigzagging, I got to the top of the hill, the enemy machine gunning from all sides. At this stage, my platoon was completely disrupted. I was by myself, and looking over the ridge, I saw what seemed to be a section of the enemy lying on the ground about 5 yards away. I fired into them, but they didn't move. I was attracted by a movement to my left, and at about 4 yards distance, an enemy soldier was kneeling beside a tree. I can see him now. He was covered by a camouflage net. It looked like one of ours. I swung my gun towards him and aimed. We seemed to be aiming at one another for hours, yet it was only seconds. I next felt as if a ton weight had fallen on my left shoulder. I immediately turned and jumped for cover under the ridge of grapevine and sat down. I stayed under cover a while as I'd lost my gun. Lying low for a while, I decided to move and get away under cover of the grapevines. Being on my own, I started on my way back. I must have been 3,000 to 4,000 yards in front of my own company headquarters. God knows how far back I went when I came upon stretcher bearers. The wound I'd received had put my left arm out of action. My collarbone was broken. My scapula was fractured. My arm was hanging useless. I was now starting to feel pain. As I approached the stretcher bearers, I saw one of them had a Sten gun. I immediately took the Sten gun from him and went back to resume the attack. The stretcher bearers came after me, overpowered me, and tied me onto a stretcher. Arthur Skingley was later awarded a DCM. Goodness, what a brave man. By early afternoon, the Dorsets too had been thrown off this hill. When the Germans finally withdrew, the British found they'd laid booby traps among the dead, including Nigel Stickland's body. This was a new unpleasantness and one they would get used to. The retreating enemy left mines and booby traps all over the place, killing civilians and unwary soldiers. The high casualties suffered by Major Cort's 66th Field Company testify to how dangerous clearing these devices proved. A couple of days later, they lost 7 men killed in a single incident. The Germans now withdrew, blowing roads and bridges as they went, and slowing the advance considerably as alternative routes had to be found or bridges repaired. During this fierce battle with the Germans, though, to the east of Vizzini, 2 Hampshire soldiers got lost on the Green Knoll, and they wandered into the village itself. And they found it occupied by an Italian officer with 45 soldiers, who immediately surrendered. So these 2 Hampshires marched the lot back down the hill, having captured the town. Extraordinary story. The Battle of Vizzini was over. All 3 battalions had fought hard and bravely. 22 lives had been lost, but they couldn't take the Green Knoll from the German defenders. When 51st Highland Division tried to take it, they actually they found it, the whole thing deserted. The Germans had just melted away. They were very, very good at doing that. Read 18 platoon, it comes up again and again. They melted after a really quite a big fight. Once across the Detain, I'm not going to tell you about these 2 anymore. If we do Normandy, these 2 will reappear. They're great blokes.
What do you mean if? We're definitely doing it.
Right,
There's no question about it. And just thank you for what you've said. And I can't wait to hear what James has to add in a minute, because we look at the map of Sicily and we just see those arrows going up there. And you can just, okay, the brigade moved from here to here. And then when you break it down to all that effort for just a little grassy knoll that seemingly has no big importance at all, you drive past it and not even notice it, and yet so many men suffered for that one. I'm not going to say insignificant, because it was very significant if you died there, but that it breaks it all down as to why this is Infantry Week, and why talking about infantry and what they went through is always thoroughly important, because it's just never-ending crap day after day. Being
shelled is the principal occupation of the infantry soldier.
Yeah.
Once across the River Deteno, the brigade pushed north towards Agira, and it got just worse and worse. I mean, Vizzini was bad, Agira was appalling. I'm not going to tell you about it, because it's just a repetition of Vizzini again and again and again, with the brigade learning their trade and getting rather better at capturing these places, but the Germans being just as effective, the defences just as difficult to deal with, and a lot of casualties: 17 Devons, 22 Hampshires, 33 Dorsets, 5 field gunners, 4 anti-tank gunners, all trying to take Agira. But despite their best efforts, our 231 Brigade's best efforts, the Germans had cleared their escape route from Agira and were now able to retreat east to Regalbuto. And here, the Malta Brigade would fight the last major battle of the campaign, in which Major Roy Porter, then a lieutenant, would play quite an important role. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Christopher. And there's Agira, so they're moving on from Agira, and what I can say is that dogged, relentless fighting is now going on all along the front. And as 231 Brigade approached Regalbuto, you can see on the right there from Agira, which is off to the left, as they approached, what they didn't realize was that Agira was a key position. It's not Agira, so Regalbuto was a key position in the German defense line. In fact, it was strongly held by the engineer battalion of the Hermann Goering division. Well, the brigade advanced along the road. You can see on the left there, the brigade advancing along, and the first Dorsets captured a hilltop feature which is known as Mount Stupari, which I've marked there. Now, Mount Stupari was a prominent hill, and it was on a ridge line running southeast. The hill is actually to the right or to the south of the road, and it's less than 2 miles from Regalbuto centre off to the right. But the way ahead was barred by the Regalbuto Bridge, and the Regalbuto Bridge was 1,000 yards in front of the Dorsets at this stage, and it was preventing any further advance towards Regalbuto. The ridge itself consisted of 3 distinct features, and there were defense positions on each of the 3. Highest one was off to the east, and that dominated the town. So something had to be done. And at 20:30 hours on the 29th of July, under cover of supporting fire from the Dorsets who were on the Stupari feature, the 1st Battalion of the Hampshires put in a frontal company attack. But the attack was stopped by heavy artillery fire and also by mortar and machine gun fire, which was coming from positions on the ridge. Now, that meant that it was absolutely clear that no further advance towards Regalbuto would be possible whilst the Regalbuto ridge remained in enemy hands. It simply had to be taken. And at 5:30 in the morning of the 30th of July, Brigadier Roy Urquhart, the brigade commander, gave the task to Lieutenant Colonel William Valentine, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, the Devonshire Regiment. Now, this task was a most daunting one. Not only was the ridge strongly held by the Germans, but a company-sized attack by the Hampshires, as we have seen, was halted decisively. The chances of success without horrendous casualties by another frontal attack seemed remote. Now, a word about Bill Valentine, or Cupid Valentine, as he was widely known. He was a very fine tactician, and certainly that's what my father told me. And whilst some junior officers will often be in awe of their commanding officers, there is evidence to back my father up. You see, Valentine was the author of a pre-war platoon-level tactics pamphlet entitled Sand Table Exercises. And this continued in print into the 1950s. And I've got a copy printed in the 1950s in which Valentine's original exercises have been updated by a Brigadier Turner to reflect changes in weapons and doctrines, but it's proof that Valentine had a great interest in and a flair for tactics. Well, Valentine now met the brigade commander at 05:30 at a bend in the road, which is marked on the map, and you can see it there as Peteruta. What he proposed was a daring night flank march and an attack upon the enemy's right flank. And here is a sketch map of the attack made by Colonel Valentine himself after the battle. Brigadier Urquhart now approved the plan, and he sought and received by 7:30, that's within 2 hours, the approval of General Simmons, who was commanding the Canadian Division, which the brigade was part of. General Simmons promised support for the attack from all 144 of the division's artillery guns. And here is an outline of the whole plan superimposed onto a Google Earth image. Now, clearly the route's approximate, and I'm sure that had any of the people who took part in that night attack was able to go back later on, they wouldn't have been able to retrace their footsteps. Well, Colonel Valentine now sent off Lieutenant Frank Pearson off with a small patrol from Peteruta to try to find a route round the enemy's right flank. And you can clearly see on this map the approximate route that he took, halfway down a steep slope running from the main road down to the large lake, Lake Pozzillo. Amazingly, Pearson managed to get within 200 yards of the enemy in broad daylight without detection. And he located a suitable area for the battalion to form up for its night flanking attack. Here again is the approximate route on Google Earth. The route's about 2 miles over terrain that was arduous and difficult by day, and one can only imagine the difficulties in the darkness with 3 rifle companies stumbling along in a great single file snake. I can also well imagine that each man was praying that the enemy wouldn't detect them and bring down a hurricane of artillery fire. And of course, all the while, those men knew that even if they succeeded in reaching the FUP, the forming up place, undetected, they then faced an attack in darkness and up a steep hill to a heavily defended ridgeline. And so,
James, quick question for you.
Yeah.
Any attempts to silence their equipment or sandbags over their boots or, you know, rags around the buckles and things that would rattle?
Yes, that's all normal procedure. So all of that would have taken place. Yes.
Right. Thank you.
Okay. So at 9 p.m. On the 30th of July, under the cover of the noise of the supporting artillery barrage, the Devons set off. They were led by B Company, which was to capture the far or eastern end of the ridge. They were followed by A Company, whose objective was the center of the hill, and then D Company, which was to capture the near or western end of the hill. C Company remained in reserve back at Pesheruta. And back there, C Company had 2 6-pounder Portee vehicles and a 3-ton truck, all poised to race forward to rejoin the battalion if the attack succeeded. Also ready to move up with a mortar platoon, the anti-tank platoons, and 1 carrier per company with ammunition, food, and water. Now, the Germans would no doubt have expected the British to attack again, and quite possibly to attack by night. And indeed, the Germans soon determined that some form of attack appeared to be imminent, and they now called down a defensive artillery barrage. But they couldn't detect exactly where the attack would take place. And clearly expecting another frontal assault, they called their barrage down where they expected the attack to go in, and it fell harmlessly on the road in front of the ridge. Now, all the flashes and bangs of the explosions of that would have drawn, no doubt, the eyes of the defenders in that direction. Now, let's look in more detail at the Google Earth picture and see the enemy positions as well as the company objectives. Yeah. For some reason, the arrows didn't come out on that map.
Yes, they are.
On the last map.
Oh, okay. Christoper, do you want to step in for a second? Is anything you can add? Let James recover for a second.
This was the most extraordinary battle by the Devonshire Regiment. I mean, the Devons in their history have a number of things they're amazingly proud of. Bois-de-Batte in the First World War, where they held a massive German assault in May 1918. And that's why if you ever meet a Devon and Dorset or a Rifles now, if you ask him to show you his shoulder, you'll see a Croix de Guerre ribbon on his sleeve. That's where they won that. This measures up to that. This Regalbuto is as big an achievement by the Devons as any of those other battles that you could mention, including Wagon Hill in the Boer War, where they captured this hill above Ladysmith. They did fantastically well at Regalbuto, it should probably have been a brigade attack rather than a battalion one, and they just made it. And James will tell you about that in just a minute when he's recovered.
Yep.
Are you all right, James, or do you want to take a break and
No. If you could put it back on.
Yep, sure. Soldiering on. Your father would be proud.
Yeah. Okay. Now, look, this is this is a modern photograph, as you can work out, but it does show the approach route that the battalion took. In the distance, on the left-hand side, you can see the hilltop village of Agira. Petaruta, the starting point, would have been somewhere down between us and Agira, and the route is along there, and you can see down to it skirts past the lake and gets to the FUP down there on the right somewhere. This is a picture from the same place looking downhill, down towards where the FUP would have been. It would have been somewhere down there. Here you can see the company objectives on the ridge, and note that Battalion Tactical Headquarters, or TAC, was travelling with D Company onto the western end of the hill. Now, that's the commanding officer's tactical headquarters, and its location, and there are probably about half a dozen men in it. Their location is of particular importance to me because my father, Rowley Porter, was with the commanding officer in TAC HQ for the attack. He was then a lieutenant, as Christoper said, and he was the battalion intelligence officer, having recently handed over command of the anti-tank platoon with its 6-pounder guns, which he had been commanded when they landed at Marzamemi. Now, this sketch shows the outline of the attack from the viewpoint of the attacking Devons, although, of course, what each man was able to see in the darkness as they began to climb up the long, steep hill is debatable. Miraculously, the battalion's night march had gone well despite the arduous terrain. They were, as yet, undetected, and the attack went in as planned. Now, you'll notice a blue cross on the sketch of the assault. This spot is approximately in the center of the battalion attack. And this image looks uphill towards the enemy's positions. This is D Company's objective, and it shows just how steep the hill was. Here's A Company's objective, taken from the same spot, whilst the leading company, B Company, whose objective was furthest east and so closest to the town, they faced the toughest climb. And this, as you can see from the photograph, which I took. Now, I have never taken part in a battalion or company night attack with an enemy firing live ammunition at me. I have taken part in night attacks where the ammunition used has been blank, apart from a couple of machine guns firing live ammunition towards us, but over our heads. Now, those machine guns had been carefully sighted and fixed in position so that the rounds went 15 feet over our heads. But when you see lines of tracer appearing to come straight at you, and you hear the crack, crack, crack as the bullets whip overhead, you really think it's coming for you. And you look left and right and you see everybody advancing with you is bent over double as if pushing into a hurricane. It's a terrifying experience, even though you know it should be safe. So for the Devons that night, it was much worse. And to make matters even worse, for B Company, they now encountered a tank on the Agira to Regalbuto road, possibly quite close to where this photograph was taken. The tank was moving up and down and firing at anything that moved. Now, that caused some casualties to one of the platoons of B Company, and it was pinned down for a while. But the company commander, Captain Pat Spread, managed to avoid the tank by leading his other 2 platoons up behind the tank. In other words, moving between the tank and the town. And he went up and got on to his objective. And at about 2 o'clock in the morning, B Company, that company's fired the success signal flare. That was followed by A Company after some sharp fighting about a quarter of an hour later at 2:15. The center enemy position, which had been A Company's objective, was now discovered to be a particularly strong position covered by deep slit trenches and commanding all the approaches from the west. And interestingly, there was also an anti-tank gun there, and its crew had thrown a few grenades and then abandoned the gun and run off. And when the Devons got there, they squinted along the sights and discovered that the gun was carefully trained onto the very bend in the road at Petaruta that Colonel Valentine had met the brigade commander the previous morning. So, Regalbuto Ridge is now in the Devons' hands, and my father, Lieutenant Porter, was sent back to brief the brigadier and to bring forward C Company, the battalion reserve. Colonel Valentine then began to move TAC HQ forward towards B Company's position. Now, B Company at this stage still only had 2 of its 3 platoons, the third still being pinned down by the tank. And ominously, much enemy activity in the town could now be clearly heard by B Company. What they heard was the sound of marching bodies of troops and shouted commands. Captain Pat Spread, the company commander, was determined to maintain the initiative, and at first light, accompanied by his company sergeant major, Sammy Jones, and a section of men, he set off on a tank hunting patrol. Unfortunately, they were spotted by the tanks. The tanks opened fire, and Pat Spread and Sammy Jones were killed, together with several other men, and any survivors from that party were all wounded. Company Sergeant Major Sammy Jones, by the way, had been a star football player back in Malta, and when news of his death reached the island, there was a 2-minute silence held in the Valletta football stadium in his honor. Well, those German tanks now began firing at B Company's position. And given the German army's standard operational practice of immediately counterattacking any lost position, it'll come as no surprise that a fierce German counterattack now took place onto the ridge. B Company still only had 2 of its 3 platoons up on the objective, and they had lost their company commander and their company sergeant major. Perhaps not surprisingly, the enemy got a foothold on the ridge, and B Company were forced off it. The position was becoming precarious. The enemy appeared to be in about 2 company strength, and Colonel Valentine now summoned reinforcements from his other companies and deployed the freshly arrived reserve C Company to bolster A Company and thus prevent the Germans advancing along the ridgeline. A Company and C Companies were now under attack, and they were under attack from what appeared to be well-trained and determined 19 or 20-year-old German troops armed with automatic weapons and a plentiful supply of ammunition. German tactics were to infiltrate forward in pairs and continually appear in unexpected places. But A Company, C Company, and the remains of B Company held their ground, despite the fact that their ammunition was running low. In fact, all the grenades and 2-inch mortar bombs had been expended, and the Brens were down to the last 2 or 3 magazines. Even Brigadier Urquhart, who had now arrived, cobbled together an ad hoc group from his headquarters and committed them to battle. The ridge had to be held. But now my father was back with his CO, and he found himself amongst the surviving B Company men, including men of his old 11 platoon, which he'd commanded in Malta, as he used to call it, 11 platoon of the bloody 11th, because the Devons were the 11th of foot. Well, my father borrowed a rifle from a Corporal Phillips, and he fired away at the enemy until he was himself shot and wounded. He was ordered back to the regimental aid post by the CO, and as he departed, he told me that he handed his rifle to the CO saying, "It's your turn now, sir." Well, gradually, the enemy counterattack slowed and was stopped. It was then thrown off the hill by a bayonet charge from D Company, which Colonel Valentine sent forward in a right flanking attack. And the Germans at once started to withdraw all along the front line. The Devons began fixing bayonets, cheering and charging forward to drive the Germans off the ridge. So, with this dominating feature now in Allied hands, the Germans immediately began to evacuate Regalbuto. The town was entered by the Dorsets, advancing to the north of Regalbuto Ridge, and also by the Canadians from the south. And before the end of the Sicily campaign, the Devons were able to return to the battlefield and erect a temporary monument. After the war, the monument was replaced by a more imposing one, and here's a photograph I took of it a few years ago. It stood proudly just above the Agira Regalbuto Road, roughly in the center of the battalion attack. It has subsequently been moved a short distance onto firmer ground. Well, the battle for Regalbuto was now over. It had cost the Devons 109 casualties, including 27 dead, of whom 8 were officers. Not one of the 5 officers in D Company and not one of the 4 rifle commanders who had landed at Marzamemi less than 3 weeks previously remained alive or unwounded. So back to the overall picture. Slowly and gradually, the Allies pushed the Germans back. The German commander, General Huber, conducted a skillful withdrawal, moving back from phase line to phase line and successfully breaking contact with the Allies each time. Messina fell and the fighting ended on the 17th of August. However, during the 6 days prior to that, the Germans managed to successfully evacuate by sea almost all their forces across the narrow Straits of Messina to the Italian mainland in Operation Lehrgang. Now, with hindsight, it's almost inexplicable, I believe, that no attempt was made to prevent the crossings. And that's despite the fact the Allies enjoyed almost total command of the air and the sea. And we'd captured a copy of the German plan for the evacuation a week earlier. Now, admittedly, the Germans had positioned a very large number of anti-aircraft guns around the area of the crossings, and Allied aircraft had learned to stay clear. And admittedly, it would have been risky to send warships into the confined waters of the Straits. Yet the opportunity to disrupt and even halt the crossings offered a prize surely worthy of considerable risk. And the numbers evacuated in Unternehmen, or Operation Lehrgang, as you can see there, were quite considerable. However, as Monty later recalled, there appeared to be no plan to interfere with the crossings. Admiral Cunningham admitted that the Allied Chiefs of Staff had not even discussed it. Well, that evacuation was a major German tactical triumph, which was to have strategic implications later, because as the German General von Vietinghoff later said, the evacuation was of decisive significance for the entire later campaign in Italy. He added that his best troops in Italy were the ones that had come from Sicily. And that was almost certainly true, because those German soldiers who fought in Sicily remembered their efforts there with pride. They now had good reason to believe that they could stop or seriously delay the British and Americans, even if outnumbered and outgunned. And so it was to prove on the mainland of Italy, where those same experienced and battle-hardened German troops would have to be fought by the Allies all over again. And now back to Christoper.
Now, what I was going to do at this point, had we had time, had we not had the gremlin attacks that we've suffered, I don't think I've ever given a talk anywhere which has been so susceptible to things going wrong. And we do apologize.
We got there in the end.
I think we rose above it. What the cost of it is, I'm very quickly just going to say then, it cost the brigade 770 casualties, the Sicily thing, in 3 weeks. They won 66 decorations. They showed themselves just as good as any of Monty's more experienced 8th Army people who'd fought their way across from Alamein. And of course, as a result of it, they were chosen, first of all, to lead an assault landing on Italy, on the Toe, in September 1943. And then they were chosen again, big story, to be on the right of the invading forces here, or the British invading forces, on the 6th of June, near where you are now, Paul.
Victims of their own success, I think, is the classic.
Victims of their own success. What an honour.
Yeah, well, brilliant stuff. I mean, we just, to acknowledge what James said about Messina, because as soon as James gave his interpretation of it, it all fired off in the sidebar there, because when we did our Husky series, Kevin Hemel was on, Vince O'Hara, who's a naval expert. It's the Navy, basically, that made the decision not to go in and do that. And absolutely, it may have been a risk worth taking. There's lots of guns on the Italian mainland, but they didn't. And we have to play with the events that panned out, and that they didn't make an attempt to do it, and the Germans got across, and there we are where we are. But you said at the beginning, Christoper, just to sort of sum up, this is what draws Urquhart to the attention of other people, isn't it? His leadership here, his determination. Do you want to sort of sum up what it was that they saw in him, particularly in Sicily?
He was a thruster. He wouldn't give up. He was at points during the advance up to Agira. 231 Brigade were way out in front with nobody on their flanks. It was a fantastic performance. And of course, Monty was watching him. Now, immediately after, they had this landing in Italy, which was actually started disastrously, where they were all landed in the wrong place at the wrong time. They recovered from that. They fought a brilliant action on Italy, and then started the advance north towards Salerno. So what Monty did was immediately remove Urquhart from command, sent him off, brought him to his TAC headquarters, where he spent a few days with Monty. So, this was Blue-Eyed Boy. He then sent Urquhart off and gave him a staff job, which Urquhart was furious about. Yeah. But of course, what he was doing was preparing him to command a division. And that is exactly what happened. And the rest is history.
It is, although a history that is worthy of discussion, because whether or not he was the right one to command an airborne division is a perennial question that has been answered by many with different answers and different responses. But
interestingly, I was in touch with this family who are delightful, and they sent me some stuff that he'd written, and he said his happiest time and the most effective time he thought in his career was when he was commanding 231 Brigade in Sicily and in Italy. I think Arnhem was a sad experience.
It was. And just to sum up this show, Christoper and James, is that we've done various shows about infantry units that had long wars. In fact, just yesterday we were talking about the American 3rd Division, who fought all the way through the war. The fact that, as James said, they erected a monument when the campaign is still pretty much raging there shows that these battles were important at the time. They remained important long-term after the war. To the 231 Brigade survivors, the Devons, the Dorsets, the Hampshires, where did Sicily rank? And if it ranks somewhere, does it rank in terms of misery, the heat, difficult fighting? What sort of things they talk about? Where is it on the 231 league table of experiences, if that isn't a too broad a question?
Well, of course, for all of them, it was their baptism of fire.
Yeah.
They'd been through Malta, but that was a peculiar experience. So it was the beginning of them finding out what it was to fight infantry battles against the Germans. And they learned quickly on Sicily. They were a lot better by the time they got to Regalbuto than they had been at Vizzini.
Yeah.
If you didn't learn quickly, you were dead. It was a real incentive. And of course, by the time they landed in Normandy, they were second to none.
Yeah.
I hope we'll be looking at that at some point.
Well, we definitely will. Well, we will bring things to an end now because we will. James, thank you very much for battling on through the gremlins and the coughing. And Christopher, thanks for what you've done. And folks, some brilliant questions there. We didn't get all of them, but we can do them again next time. And I think we all have had a real insight into experience of this brigade in Sicily. And I think none of us will now look at that kind of upward arrow on the map of Sicily now with the same idea. We now know a little bit more about the trials and tribulations on that route. So thank you to you both.
Thank you.
Folks, I'm back again in the morning tomorrow, depending on where you are. So UK time, 9 o'clock, we are with Peter Hart talking about infantry of the Royal Norfolks in 1940 in the Dunkirk perimeter. So I'll see you all for that. Thanks everybody for watching. See you all next time. This is Paul Woodhead for World War II TV saying enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. Bye, everybody.